What's up, Buck Doug with D&E in the Garage? I have some automotive news for you. This story came to me via one of our Patreons. Scott down there in Queensland, Australia, hit me up and he said, hey man, did you hear that Holden, the Australian car company, is being killed off? GM owns Holden. They came out recently, I think last week, and they said, hey, by 2021, the Holden brand will be dead. They're pulling out of Australia and New Zealand, a couple other markets like Thailand and other Asian Pacific markets they're pulling out of. So Scott hit me up about this, and I said, wow, I didn't know that. I had no idea. So I went to look for more information on it, and there's almost no information. It's like a footnote in other articles. Oh yeah, and by the way, Holden's being killed off by GM. Nobody's talking about it. I don't think that's right because Holden deserves better than that. So D&E's got you covered. We're gonna talk about it here today. We're gonna talk about what GM's doing, why they're doing it. We're definitely gonna talk about some Holden history because Holden is a crazy cool company. The reason we here in the United States need to care about this, 3 of the coolest cars that were sold in the United States in the last 20 years were actually Holdens, and most people don't realize it. So we're gonna get to those as well. Let's start with what GM's doing. They are pulling out of right-hand drive markets. They said they do not feel as though right-hand drive markets fit what they're trying to do anymore. So they're pulling out of Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, other Asia Pacific markets, and they're trying to shrink their global footprint. The reason they're doing this is because they want to focus on electric and autonomous vehicles. Now, I find this interesting, and we've mentioned this in previous news segments. A bunch of high-level automotive industry executives have come out recently and said, yeah man, we're kind of pulling back from the electric car thing, which is why it's interesting that while these very successful Japanese companies, Toyota, Honda, are backing away, GM is, for whatever reason, running forward headlong, killing off brands, moving assets around so that they can go harder on it. Maybe they know something we don't. History would show that they don't. They seem to be allergic to success in the last 50 years. They like to put all their eggs in one basket and then smash that basket against the wall and then look at the eggs and go, why are all my eggs broken? Somebody help me. And yes, I'm going to be a little hard on GM in this video because I hate when they do this. They killed off Pontiac. They killed off a bunch of other really cool brands, and now they're going after Holden. It's a bummer. I am a sucker for nostalgia, and I hate seeing storied old car brands go away because when they go away, they're nameplates we can never get back. I'm still bitter that we will never get a retro restyle GTO, and now I'm bitter that we're never going to get a Holden style Ute in the United States, but we'll get to that later. First, let's talk some about the history of Holden. All right, Holden started in 1856. 1856 in Australia as a saddle maker. All right. When automobiles came around, they started getting into automobile repair. Not engines, but like they would fix upholstery or they would rebody older vehicles. All right. In the 19-teens, they started making their own motorcycle sidecars, so you could buy a Holden motorcycle sidecar to add to your whatever motorcycle. World War I comes around and it gets harder to get automobiles in Australia. Lots of trade regulations and things just shutting down while the world fought itself. So they start rebodying, or not rebodying, but bodying Ford and GM chassis. So they would take a Ford or GM chassis, you've got the driveline, everything's there, and then it would have a Holden body on it. All right. In 1926, GM comes in and they buy Holden and they merge with Holden. It's GM Holden Automotive. So what GM is now doing since 1926, they are selling GM vehicles. They are American designed vehicles, the same vehicle you would have got here in the United States as a Buick or a Chevrolet or an Oakland, and they're sending it to Australia, and instead of a GM or a Buick or an Oakland, it's got a Holden badge on it, but they're the same vehicles they were selling in the United States. Now this didn't work super well because, as anybody who's ever looked at a map knows, Australia is different than the United States. Completely different. So the vehicles that were built here for our infrastructure didn't really work in Australia. They had different needs, point blank. So in 1948, an executive at Holden finally convinces some people at GM, like, hey man, let us build our own vehicles. There'll still be GM Holdens, GM engineers will be helping with design, but let's build them for what Australians actually need, all right? And they do, and they build very similar vehicles to what you would have gotten here, but they fit the more rugged terrain. And one vehicle that Holden designed in 1950, they just called it the utility vehicle. And it was quickly shortened to the Ute. All right, now, as an American, when I think of Australian automobiles, the Ute is synonymous with Australian vehicles. It is the iconic thing. And what it is it's sort of like an El Camino or a Ranchero, but just a different spice to it. It's a two-door little tiny car with a bed, and in 1950 they came out with the first one, and they've been making them ever since in various iterations. And honestly, it's the one thing that I wish we could get here. We've gotten a lot of Holdens in the United States, and like I said, we're going to talk about those later, but we never got a Ute, and I want a Ute. I would buy a Ute. I would trade in this Grand Cherokee tomorrow if I could get a Ute here in the United States. Bold take, I know, but it's the truth. Another interesting thing about Australia is the way Australian car culture mirrors American car culture, but with their own spice. You couldn't really say that like British and American car cultures mirror each other. They don't. They each do their own separate thing. They're each cool for their own reasons, but they really don't parallel in very many ways. Australian and American car culture parallels in a very big way, and then the Australians just add their own little down under Aussie spice to it. This is particularly evident in the 1960s race culture. Right now, here in the United States, we have Daytona, we have NASCAR, they have Bathurst. That's where they race, and it's a different, more rugged style of racing that typically lended itself better to tiny little compact British mini type vehicles. Well, in the 60s, Holden put out a vehicle called the Monaro. Think of the Monaro the way you think of the 1960s Mustangs in the United States. It's a high-powered sports car that's meant to appeal to the everyman and is affordable to the everyman. That's what the Monaro is. And the Monaro comes in and it starts taking over the Bathurst racing. So in the 60s and 70s, they kind of transformed themselves into a race brand. They've got all the GM motors we have here, 427s and everything. They're just in a slightly different Holden designed vehicle, which is pretty cool. Then in the mid 70s, when van culture was a thing here in the United States, they did that too. So we were all buying up vans and putting shag carpet in them and painting big unicorns on the side. They took a Monaro front and a Belmont panel van and they grafted them together, and they made this crazy thing called the Sandman. It looks like a weird drawing of an old style ambulance, but super cool. Just another example of how Holden took what we were doing in the United States and made it more appealing to the Australians, which is why when Scott mentioned this story, he was like upset. He's like, yeah man, we're really bummed here. Like, this brand is part of our national identity. In the 70s, Holden ran an ad that said football, meat pies, kangaroos, and Holden cars. We're trying to say that Holden is part of Australia, and granted, it's a bit of their own marketing, but from what I can tell, that is how the majority of Australia feels. Now, Ford also does have a very big presence in Australia. They have the Falcon, which kind of goes up against the Commodore, which is a great segue into the Commodore, which is probably, after the Utes, my favorite Holden vehicle. Now, the Commodore came into play in 1978 as a four-door sedan and a wagon. It's kind of a family mover. And very quickly, it became a race nameplate. Here's what happened. In 1987, well, in 1986, Holden is sitting there. Australia's just passed a law that by 1987, all vehicles sold in Australia need to run on 91 octane. Holden doesn't have a single motor in the stable that can run on 91 octane. They got all these old GM blocks. So they go looking to source a new engine to put in the Commodore so that they can be compliant. And what they come up with is the Nissan Inline 6 that went in the Skyline. All right, so now you've got this crazy boxy little four-door that has this crazy juiced up Nismo engine in it, and these things took off like crazy. Their cops were driving, I believe, turboed versions of these things, which is just an awesome example of how Holden takes what other people are doing in other parts of the country and just add some Aussie twist. They're like, I don't care, we'll put a friggin' Nismo engine in this thing. Absolutely a crazy car, something that I think we should have gotten here in the United States. It's a huge bummer that GM had had all this cool stuff, the Monaro, this crazy Commodore under their umbrella and didn't think to bring it here. I truly believe GM may be allergic to success in some certain ways. Now, let's talk about the vehicles we did get here. There were 3 in the early to mid 2000s that we got here in the United States that I'll bet you don't even realize were Holdens, right? Now, in 2001, Holden brought back the Monaro as a 2-door, little, very sporty, very round coupe. It was always a 2-door, but they brought it back in 2001, brought back the nameplate. Bob Lutz over at GM sees this thing and he says, wow, that thing would sell in the United States. So in 2004, they release it as Pontiac GTO. The Pontiac GTO rebirth we got was actually a Holden Monaro that they just rebadged as the GTO. Now, I'm gonna take a little detour right now. I was super bummed that GTO, after we got that one, it was right around that time when they started doing retro remakes of vehicles. You had the Challenger and the Charger come back. You had the, what was it, the 5th gen? Which Mustang was it after the SN95 that was all redesigned? A little bit later was the Camaro. When we got the GTO back, I thought the next step was going to be getting us a rebranded. Could you imagine a modern looking, old styled GTO? That would have been awesome. I truly believe that was going to happen. And then GM did what GM does and they killed off Pontiac. Now, if you liked the GTO, you probably loved the G8. Remember the G8 from 2008? All right, the G8 had the LS1 from the Corvette. It was actually a Holden Commodore. The 4-door Commodore was the same thing as the Pontiac G8 that we got in 2008. Now, another side detour. I actually have a whole rant about Pontiac and how GM could have not killed off Pontiac that at some point you guys will get. I'm still doing research on it. But I believe the G8 could have saved Pontiac because it was an awesome car. It was a crazy cool car. It appealed to a wide range of people. The only problem with the G8 is when it was released. It was released in 2008. There are so many vehicles that would have done better, but they were released either right before or right after 2008, global recession, gas crisis, everybody's switching to Prius, nobody can afford new cars. The Jeep Commander is another example of this. The Commander should have had a longer, better life. If it had been tweaked and updated a little bit, and not been trying to sell in 2008, I think it would have survived much longer. The G8 is the same thing, but if you liked that car, and you should, because it's freaking awesome, it's a 4-door Corvette, basically. It's really a Holden. Now, my absolute favorite of this group is one that primarily only the police here got to drive. If you're familiar with the Chevy Caprice PPV, that is a VE Commodore. That's the next generation of Commodore after the G8, and that thing is insane. All right, we have some of them in our town. They look mean. They are quick. I've seen a couple of the officers in our town take off at red lights. Forget about it, man. Now, we did get this car as the Chevy Ss. They sold it for one model year, 2014. A very cool car. RCR, Regular Car Reviews, got their hands on one, and they found a way to not crap all over it, as they usually do with American cars. So go check that out. Very cool car. I love this thing. This one, if I could have any Holden that we actually got here, this is the one I would want. Now, the problem with this one is they sold it for one model year, and if you go to buy parts for it, you have to get them through Holden, which is why not many people are really seeking them out here. You can get the retired police versions, but I guess they have cam issues from idling the way, you know, police, they sit there idling, they chew up cams, then it's hard to get a new cam and nobody knows how to do the work on them. So it's a bummer that GM didn't go harder on getting us Holdens here, because the ones we got are so in such few numbers that they never really took off. But those are three of the coolest cars that have been sold in this country since the year 2000. Three of the coolest cars, definitely three of the coolest GMs, and we have Holden to thank for it. Now, let's get back to Holden being killed off. If you are in Australia and you have a Holden, They're going to continue. I think they're employing 200 technicians to stay in Australia and continue to be a network to service Holdens that are under warranty, whatever. Apparently, GM is still going to sell the C8 Corvette in Australia. It was promised that it was coming to Australia as a Chevy, not as a Holden, and it's still going to come as a Chevy. I don't really know how they're going to sell it because they're closing their dealerships, but you will still be able to get your Holden worked on, and you will still be able to get your C8 if you wanted one down there in Aussie land. Now, as anybody who's ever seen this channel knows, I'm a big history nut, a huge automotive history nut, so it really bums me out when you see one of these storied old brands going away, because we never get it back, right? Pontiac. I hate that Pontiac was killed off, because there are a ton of amazing nameplates, the Firebird, the Fiero, the GTO, and yes, I said the Fiero, that I think could have been reborn in today's world. The Fiero could absolutely, they could have brought the Fiero back and it would have sold well, but Pontiac's dead now, and so we'll never get that. Holden being gone is a huge hit to the identity of Australia, from my understanding. Again, obviously not an Australian, but from what I understand in doing my research for this video, Australia is really identified with the Holden brand. If you look at RCR's New Zealand trip, they drove a bunch of Holdens. They're really cool cars. They are really cool cars. I truly love how Holden was able to take American, United States car culture and tweak it for its own purposes. So when you look at Australian car culture and Holden vehicles, as an American, you dig them and you can relate to them. Whereas, like, as an American who digs American big displacement engines, when I look at what happens in Europe with cars, I don't understand or care at all. Like, I don't get into that. It's not my jam. I don't care about your Porsches. I certainly don't care about whatever they're doing over there. But I look at Holden and what they did in Australia, and like almost every single Holden that they've ever put out, I get it and I dig it. And it's a bummer that it went away. And GM, screw you. I'm just gonna say it. I don't hate you, but I do hate the way you do business sometimes. And I understand there's no room for nostalgia in business, but sitting here in my heated leather seats, I don't have to worry about that. I get to just complain about the way things went. So, if you are in Australia or have ever had the opportunity to drive any Holden vehicles, be it here in the United States as a GTO, G8, or SS, or whatever, I want to know what your favorite Holden was, or your favorite Holden story. Tell me more about Holden. Let's celebrate Holden here. Let's give them a last hurrah. Let's pour one out for this storied brand, almost a 200-year-old company, which is fascinating. Because that's older even than the automotive companies in the United States. A couple of the American automotive nameplates were around a little bit before cars, making coaches or something, but nothing like 1856. That's crazy. Y'all almost made it 200 years, GM killed you off. So let me know your Holden stories, what you think, what your experience with the Holden brand was, what you think about Chevy pulling back from, and they specifically mentioned pulling back from right-hand drive markets. That's a direct quote from an article I found from a GM executive. So it wasn't just about killing off brands. They really want to shrink what they're doing. Let me know if you know anything more about that and what your opinions on that are. And if another thing I'd like to know, if you're in Australia, tell me about the Holden-Ford rivalry. Because my understanding is that it's exactly like the Ford-GM rivalry here, but maybe I'm misunderstanding that. So one last thing, I'm going to do a shameless plug for a future video real quick. Eric and I, you guys have been asking us to do an AMA and ask me anything for a long time. We're finally going to do it. We're giving you guys the opportunity to ask us any single question you want, and while we're answering these questions, we're going to do a hot wing challenge. We got 10 hot sauces ranging from, I think, 500 Scoville units up to 500,000 Scoville units. If you've ever seen the YouTube show Hot Ones, we're kind of taking a cue from there. It's going to be in that vein. So if there are any questions you've ever wanted to ask D&E in the garage, whether it's about automotive, life, philosophy, I don't care, leave them either here or on one of our Instagram or Facebook posts, and we will answer. We're going to answer every single question we get. If the video has to be 4 hours long, so be it. Eric may die. He does not eat spicy food. I don't know why he agreed to do this with me. I may die because I eat spicy food, but 5,000 Scoville units insane. So leave us any questions, along with all the information I want to know from you about Holden and what you think. Leave any questions you have. We're filming this coming Sunday, which will be like maybe March 1st, and it is going to premiere Friday, March 6th. So we'll do the full premiere type thing. So leave us your questions today so that we can answer them on Sunday as we masochistically stuff wings into our face, and then you guys will get the video on Friday. So close it out. If you like the video, by all means like the video. That's common sense, right? Subscribe to the channel. Consider checking us out on Patreon, Etsy, and Teespring. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.